I never wanted to betray my country. But there comes a moment in every soldier's life when obedience becomes a crime. For me, that moment came in the summer of 1944, when I realized that to save Germany, Adolf Hitler had to die. That I was Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, officer of the General Staff of the Wehrmacht, husband, father, and soldier. That I had fought for the Führer's war, bled for it, nearly died for it. And yet, by the time I recovered from my wounds, I no longer recognized the nation I had once sworn to defend. That I grew up believing in duty, honor, discipline, loyalty. That was the code my father taught me. The same ideals my grandfathers carried into the old Prussian army. We were raised to serve Germany, not a man, but Hitler. He twisted that. He took our oath and made it to himself, not the country. When I raised my hand and said, "I swear unconditional obedience to the Führer," I thought I was serving the fatherland. That I was wrong. By 1943, I had seen what blind obedience had done to us. Entire cities turned to ash, thousands of young men sent to die for nothing but one man's delusions, and behind the front lines, atrocities, massacres, orders that no decent officer could ever justify. At first, I told myself it wasn't my concern, that my job was to fight, not to question. But the truth has a way of finding you, even when you try to bury it. In North Africa, I commanded the 10th Panzer Division. That we were proud men, hardened by sand and sun, fighting under Rommel's command. We believed we were holding back the tide. But the war had already been lost. In April 1943, a British fighter strafed our convoy near Tunis. The explosion tore through my jeep. When I woke up, I was covered in blood and sand. My right hand was gone. 2 fingers on my left were missing, and I could see only through one eye. For months I lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and burned flesh. They said I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, half a man. But in that emptiness, something began to grow, a clarity I had never known before. I read reports. I listened. I asked questions. And what I learned broke me. The mass killings, the deportations, the final solution. I had fought for a lie, for a regime that had poisoned everything it touched. And I remember staring at my bandaged arm and thinking, if I live, it cannot be for this. When I returned to Berlin, I was no longer the same man. That I walked through a city half in ruins, filled with wounded soldiers, widows, and children digging through rubble. The posters still showed Hitler's smiling face. But no one smiled back. At the War Office, everyone whispered the same thing in private. We are finished, but no one dared say it aloud. To speak against the Führer was to sign your own death warrant. The Gestapo listened everywhere. Even walls had ears, and yet, in the shadows, there were men who refused to surrender their conscience, men who believed that Germany could still be saved from itself. General Ludwig Beck, Colonel Henning von Treschow, General Friedrich Albrecht. Names whispered with both hope and fear. They called themselves the conscience of the army. When they invited me to join them, I didn't hesitate. I met Treschow in the spring of 1944. He looked exhausted, his face gray with worry, but his voice steadied. He told me, "Colonel, the point of no return has long passed. We must act, even if it kills us." He had already tried, more than once. There had been an attempt to blow up Hitler's plane months earlier. The bomb had failed to detonate. A miracle, they said. But Treschow called it what it was, a curse. From that day, I became part of their circle. We met in dimly lit rooms, behind locked doors, pretending to discuss logistics while we plotted the end of tyranny. The plan was bold, simple, but dangerous. It was called Operation Valkyrie. On paper, it was a contingency plan, a legal order designed by the Wehrmacht itself to suppress uprisings in the event of civil unrest. But we would twist it. Once Hitler was dead, we would use Valkyrie to seize control of the government, disarm the SS, and negotiate peace with the Allies before the Russians reached Berlin. It wasn't just treason, it was salvation. But there was one problem: getting close enough to kill him. Hitler no longer appeared in public. He lived in his fortress in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, surrounded by guards and concrete, and no civilian or general could reach him without inspection. I was one of the few who could as chief of staff to general from. I was granted access to the Führer's briefings. It was the perfect opportunity, and I knew then I would carry the bomb myself. Treschow tried to stop me. He said, "You've already sacrificed enough. Let me do it." But I shook my head. "I've already died once," I told him. "Now I must make it mean something." In June, the Allies landed in Normandy. The end was near, but Hitler refused to see it. He screamed at his generals, demanded impossible counterattacks, blamed everyone but himself. The walls of the Reich were crumbling, yet he ordered us to fight to the last. In those days, every breath in Berlin felt like borrowed time. People walked faster, talked quieter. Even the air was heavy with fear. I met Beck and Albrecht almost nightly. We discussed timing, explosives, detonation. The bomb would be disguised as a briefcase, filled with British-made plastic explosives. The detonator. A pencil-shaped fuse that ignited after 10 minutes. I would set it during the meeting, place it near Hitler, and leave. Everything depended on those 10 minutes. If it worked, the war might end within a day. If it failed, we would all hang. On July 19, 1944, I wrote to my wife, Nina. I didn't tell her the truth, only that tomorrow may be a decisive day for Germany. She must have known. She always did. That night I couldn't sleep. I thought of my children. Their faces, their laughter, the life they might have had in a better world. I prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. By dawn, my decision was final. No hesitation, no fear. The following morning, a car waited to take me to the airfield. I remember the sound of engines warming in the mist, the cold wind against my face, and the weight of the briefcase in my left hand. It wasn't just a weapon. It was the burden of every soul lost since this madness began. I boarded the plane to Rassenberg with one thought in my mind. If this succeeds, history will never know our names. But if it fails, they will call us traitors. I didn't care anymore. I only wanted it to end. And as the clouds swallowed the horizon, I whispered to myself, "This is the day. One man must die so that a nation might live." But even then, I didn't know that fate had other plans. I placed the briefcase on the floor. My hand shook, but my voice was steady. I told myself I had done what was necessary. The Wolf's Lair lay like a wound in the forest, pines all around, concrete bunkers, barbed wire. It smelled of diesel and wet wood. I remember the sun that day, hot, sharp. Heat made the flies move slow. We arrived at Rassenberg in the morning. Protocol felt absurd. Guards checked papers. Dogs nosed our boots. I wore my uniform with the same squares of rank as always. Inside, generals moved. Like statues, they bowed before him. They laughed nervously when he joked. The briefing room was a wooden barack. A long table, chairs, maps. Seating was set exactly. Hitler sat near the head. He spoke in a small voice that still filled the room. He looked at the map, at the papers, at us. I counted men. There were SS officers, Luftwaffe men, his inner circle. I knew where I had to place the case. Werner von Haften stood close. He had been with me since North Africa. He had volunteered to carry my papers. His face did not show fear. It showed only what must be done. I had rehearsed the motions endlessly. I knew when to arm the detonator. I had practiced with the fuse in my hand until my thumb was numb. The device was a small bundle in a metal case. It would not look like war to anyone in the room. Just another briefcase. I set the case down to the left of the map table. It fit against the table leg. Someone might not even notice. I pretended to check my notes. My heart beat loud in my ears. Hitler began to speak about the Eastern Front. He praised commanders. He dismissed facts that did not please him. His voice rose. The men laughed. The sound of laughter felt wrong. I moved the second case closer. Then left it. My hands were calm now. I had done everything I could. No more chance to change my mind. Haften and I left the room. We walked to the car. The sun hit my face. I breathed deep, as if to refill the part of me that had been hollowed out in the hospital. There was a terror behind my ribs, but also a strange peace. Minutes later, news came down the line that an explosion, a thunder that ripped the afternoon. Smoke and dust rose from the barack. Someone shouted, sirens began to wail. We were told over the radio that the Führer was dead. That I felt nothing at first. Then a slow warmth began to spread through me. Relief. Could it be so simple? Could the impossible have happened? We boarded the aircraft back to Berlin. That I remember the engines like a drum. Haften sat near me. We did not speak. The sky was a plain of white. Below, the forest blurred. At Tempelhof, we landed to a city that looked as if nothing had happened. But inside the war offices, everything changed. Albrecht and his staff ran the plan we had rehearsed for months. Orders flew out on army channels. Valkyrie, our contingency, was invoked as if by a hand guided from above. The radio operators in the Bendler block barked instructions over and over. Units in Berlin and across the Reich received direct orders. We sounded confident. We sounded legal. Valkyrie said the reserve army would seize control in case of a breakdown of civil order. We used the provisions as a lever. Our message: the Führer is dead. The Reich must be stabilized. I felt the brittle hope of men who have nothing left but a plan. Telephone lines hummed. Messengers ran. Soldiers in the streets took positions. In Berlin, they arrested top SS leaders at the orders we issued. At least that is what we were told. For an hour, I believed. Albrecht moved like a conductor. We controlled the narrative. Field commanders obeyed orders that appeared to come from the War Ministry itself. On paper, it should have succeeded. The men in the squares and barracks were ours for a few hours. But clouds gathered even in success. Reports came that were strange. A radio transmission said the Führer was alive. Another said he had minor injuries. Then someone at the phone laughed, a laugh that did not belong to us. We tried to hold the line. The wheels of the plan relied on communication. If lines were cut, if the wrong names reached the wrong ears, the machine stalled. We had no secret police to crush resistance. We had only lawful orders and the battered authority of the Wehrmacht. I went to see General from. He had been a supporter in private. Now he hesitated. He had the power to give the coup the cloak of legitimacy. He watched the screen of his radio with the same look he used when he contemplated officers' promotions. He wanted not to choose. Men in uniform asked for the orders to be repeated. Some commanders were uncertain. They saw crowds and SS units moving differently than our messages described. Rumors spread faster than orders. In the headquarters we used the teleprinters and radio to send out the Valkyrie proclamations. We had typed the wrong name on one of the directives. Small clerical errors in a violent hour become avalanches. Outside, the city was confused. Troops took positions at junctions, then were ordered to stand down. A commander in Potsdam refused to march, without explicit confirmation. Others hesitated because they had seen the Führer on radio denounce traitors. The voice of the supposed dead man sounded on the airwaves, calm and alive. My stomach clenched. A cold sweat ran down my neck. I walked the corridors like a man who had lost a map. Every message, every shout, every footstep could change the day. In the evening, a soldier burst in with news. Hitler was alive. He had survived the blast. He had survived the table, the wooden leg, the briefcase. Moved by some careless officer, he had walked from the rubble with wounds and fury. That moment was a physical thing. It fell like a weight across my chest. All the hope that had been building snapped. You can plan for death, even welcome it. But when the death you deliver fails, the world rebounds at you. We had done what we dared. Yet the web of power had more threads than we imagined. The SS kept loyalty. From hesitation froze action. Communications unspooled into contradiction. By nightfall, mobs of men loyal to the Führer marched past the Bendler block. We fought to hold our nerve. We tried to maintain the fiction of control. A radio proclaimed that traitors had struck. The police and parts of the army began to pick sides. Soldiers in our own barracks were uncertain. Some wept, others laughed in disbelief. That I remember the smell of stale tobacco and coffee in the command rooms. The machines that had hummed all morning choked and went silent. Albrecht was calm. Even then, he ordered more proclamations. He spoke with the authority of someone convinced that law could defeat terror. But law is paper. Paper burns quickly in a storm. Haften sat close to me as the hours fell toward midnight. We had failed to kill a man whose removal might have saved millions. That I thought of the faces of children in the streets. That I thought of letters in my desk. That I thought of Nina and our boys. The day had bent like a reed. Where we had hoped for a new Germany, we were left with broken things, and yet, even in that collapse, there were moments that felt like victory. Brief, fragile. A regiment in Berlin seized control of an SS headquarters. A policeman who had fired on the wrong orders was arrested by our men. Small acts that proved our plan had teeth. But the teeth were not enough. When the phones finally started to ring with names of arrested conspirators, I understood the shape of the end. Orders were being countermanded. Generals who had followed our paper now denied knowledge. From the pivot betrayed us in public, claiming ignorance. He handed me over to the very men we had planned to detain. They took me into the yard that night. The black sky above was thick and mute. Soldiers in the gray of the Reich looked at me with eyes that had once been brothers. I did not flinch. A captain read the sentence. It was quick. There was no trial. We had expected something different, perhaps the slow judgment of history. Instead, the world gave us a bullet. We spoke little in those last moments. Haften held my hand. I told him to be brave. He held my gaze and did not see our wide as the night closed. I had only one regret. Not that we failed. Not even that I would die. I regretted that our children might grow up in a country that still did not know what had been almost possible. But even as the executioner's shadow fell, I believed in one thing. The idea of a Germany free of tyranny had been planted. It might take years to grow. It might not grow at all. Yet a seed had been cast. They came for us just after midnight. Boots on the stone floors. The echo of authority. The same sound I had heard 1,000 times at roll call, now turned against me. The Bendler block, our headquarters, was surrounded as units, loyalists, police, all under orders from Goebbels himself. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Our radio lines were dead. The phones, silent. Every second stretched like a lifetime. We had gambled everything on a single moment. And that moment had passed. General from burst into the room with a look of fury, or maybe terror. He shouted that Hitler was alive, that our coup had failed, that we were all doomed. Then he demanded that we surrender. Albrecht stood tall, his uniform still immaculate. He tried to reason with from, "You swore you'd stand with us?" But from's loyalty was a currency already spent. He drew his pistol and declared us traitors. For a second, no one moved. The room felt frozen, as if time itself refused to go on. Then Haften stepped forward. His voice was calm. "If we are traitors, then let's die as soldiers." They locked us in a side room, me, Albrecht, Haften, and Werner von Haften. We heard shouting outside. The building shook as soldiers slammed doors, confiscated papers, destroyed files. I in the corner. A single lamp flickered. Its light made our shadows dance across the wall. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked. For a war that was ending in madness. Albrecht said softly, "History will judge us differently. They'll have to." No one answered. There was nothing left to say. After a while, from return, he announced that, to protect the honor of the army, he would hold a court-martial. It lasted less than 5 minutes and no evidence. No defense, just the verdict, death by firing squad. That very night he wanted to show the SS that he still obeyed, that he wasn't one of us, cowardice disguised as duty. They led us into the courtyard. The air outside was cool. A half-moon hung over Berlin, Pale and indifferent, I could hear distant sirens, maybe bombs, or maybe just the city mourning itself. The soldiers lined up. They were young, too young. Their hands shook as they loaded rifles. Some couldn't meet my eyes that I stood in front of them. With Hafton beside me, that he was calm. Calmer than I was. He whispered, "Let me go first so you don't have to see it." But I refused. "No, Werner. We go together." He smiled faintly. "Then let it be so." The officer in charge gave the command. From's voice cut through the air. "In the name of the Führer." I didn't let him finish. I shouted over him, "Long live sacred Germany!" A flash, then thunder. A jolt through my body. And then, nothing. But death didn't come at once. It came in pieces. A slow fading. In that space between heartbeat and silence, memories returned. My wife, Nina, the laughter of my children in the garden, the smell of pines in Swabia, the prayers I used to say as a boy before the flag of the fatherland. And then, only light. History says I died that night, and perhaps I did. But the idea we tried to give life to did not die with us.it survived. Carried in. Whispers, in secret notes, in the quiet shame of those who watched and did nothing. Every officer who signed our death order knew, deep inside, that we had been right. Because by 1945, Hitler's empire was collapsing. Berlin burned. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. And the very men who called us traitors now claimed they had always doubted him. That's the way of cowards. They rewrite their courage after the danger is gone. I am told that in the ruins of Germany, people began to speak of us differently. Not as assassins but as patriots. Not as conspirators but as men who had tried. Beck, Treschow, Albrecht, Hafton, and me. They say that in the new Germany, streets bear our names, children learn of us in schools. The word Valkyrie means something different now. Not failure, but defiance. And yet I often wonder, if the bomb had worked, if the table hadn't been so thick, if one man hadn't moved that briefcase a few inches, would history have been any kinder? Would the millions who died in the final year have lived? Would Germany have been spared its total ruin? Perhaps. Or perhaps we were always doomed to fail. Perhaps our deaths were not to change the course of the war, but to remind the world that even in darkness, there were Germans who said no. I remember the last words Treschow ever said before he took his own life, months before me. The moral value of a man begins the moment he is ready to give his life for his convictions. I understand those words now better than ever. We lost the battle, yes. But we kept our souls. And that, in the end, is the only victory worth dying for. They buried us quietly, no ceremony, no honors. Just 4 bodies under the gravel courtyard, covered before dawn. By morning. The SS had already erased our names from the lists. Our families received nothing. No message, no closure, not even a death notice, only silence. But silence in Germany never lasts. Even fear has cracks. In the days that followed, the Gestapo began their harvest. One arrest after another. They hunted anyone who had spoken to us, dined with us, or written our names in a notebook. It was a purge without mercy. By the end of July, more than 7,000 were arrested. Nearly 5,000 would die. Officers, priests, professors, even secretaries. Anyone who might have known too much or too little. Some took cyanide before the SS arrived. Others hanged themselves in their cells with piano wire. The Gestapo filmed the executions for Hitler's private amusement. He watched them alone at night in the wolf's lair, rewinding and replaying, smiling as men choked in front of the camera. That was the Germany we had tried to save. Nina, my wife, was taken with our children to a camp in the Tyrol. She was interrogated, but she never gave them what they wanted. They told her I had died a traitor's death. She told them I had died as a German, and for that, they kept her alive. Barely years later, when the war ended, she would tell our children, "Your father did what every man should have done." But back then, in the ruins of 1944, no one dared speak such words. I imagine the men who once stood beside me in those final hours. Albrecht, executed that same night. Beck, shot himself after the coup collapsed. Treschow, took a grenade on the Eastern Front rather than see the Gestapo's door. Each of us died differently, but all for the same idea. That loyalty without conscience is the death of a nation. The regime used our failure as fuel. Propaganda screamed of cowards, traitors, assassins. Posters hung in cities with our faces crossed in red. Hitler raged on the radio, calling for holy vengeance. And yet, behind the speeches, there was fear. The spell of his invincibility had cracked. For the first time, even his generals knew he could be killed in the wolf's lair. The walls were rebuilt with steel and concrete. But he was no longer the same man. He distrusted everyone. Meetings grew shorter, visitors fewer. His hands trembled, his eyes darted, searching for the next betrayal. He had survived the bomb, but the explosion still echoed inside him. S for Germany. It spiraled further into ruin. The Eastern Front collapsed. The Soviets swept across Poland on the Western Front. The Allies broke through France and crossed into Belgium. Berlin began to starve. Children wore uniforms that hung from their shoulders like rags. Old men were handed rifles and told to defend the fatherland. The oath that had bound us to Hitler now strangled the nation. I had once believed that an oath was sacred, that a man's word was his soul. But what is an oath to a tyrant? What is loyalty to a man who devours his own people? I broke that oath the day I carried the bomb, and in breaking it, I felt free. They say history is written by the victors. That may be true. But history also listens. It remembers those who spoke when silence was easier. When the war ended the next year, the world saw what we had seen. The camps, the ashes, the mountains of shoes, the rings, the hair. All the proof that obedience had built an empire of graves. Then, and only then, did they understand why we tried. In the ruins of Berlin, a few survivors of our circle gathered again. Men like Fabian von Schlabrendorf, who had been tortured but lived. They spoke quietly, carefully, in bombed-out churches and half-collapsed houses. They told the truth of what had happened, how close we had come. In 1946, when the trials began in Nuremberg, some of those same officers testified that not all Germans had obeyed, that there had been resistance, even within the army. For the first time, our names were spoken without fear. I never saw that. Germany. But I like to believe it was worth it, the pain, the failure, the death. Because a country without conscience is already lost. And if a handful of men must die to remind it of that, then so be it. I used to dream of a different ending point, one where the explosion had worked, where the tyrant was gone, and the madness stopped before it consumed everything, where my children grew up in peace, not hunger. But life rarely grants such endings. What it gives instead are echoes, whispers of what might have been, and sometimes that is enough to keep hope alive. That if I could speak once more to the men who stood beside me, I would tell them this: we failed to kill a dictator, but we proved that Germany was not just his reflection, that even in the darkest night, there were still men who saw the dawn. Because history does not remember how we died. It remembers why. And that, perhaps, is all the immortality a man can ask for. The last winter of the war was colder than any before. Even from the grave, I can remember it. The wind howled through the ruins of cities that had once been alive with song. Ashes fell like snow, and every building, every street, every mother's cry was a reminder of what obedience had cost us. Berlin was dying, so was Germany. In January 1945, the Red Army reached the Oder. The front was no longer a distant thunder. It was a storm pressing at the gates. Thousands fled west, carrying children on their backs, dragging carts through the snow. Women, old men, soldiers who had no weapons, all swallowed by the tide of retreat. Hitler still spoke of victory, He moved between his bunker and the maps, sending phantom armies into battles that no longer existed. He had become a ghost commanding shadows, and yet, people still saluted, still shouted Heil Hitler, even as the world around them burned. That was the final tragedy. Not just his madness, but our obedience to it. Some of the men who had been part of the conspiracy were still alive then. Some hid. Some had been imprisoned and were now being forced to dig trenches for their executioners. But even in defeat, the idea we died for whispered through the ranks. A few officers refused to follow orders to kill civilians. A few soldiers surrendered to save lives. They might not have known our names, but they acted with the conscience we had prayed for. Resistance spreads that way, quietly, like dawn. When the Soviets entered Berlin, they found a city that was more ruin than life. The bunker, the Führer, the empire. All turned to dust within weeks. He took his own life, surrounded by poison and delusion. And the men who once shouted Heil now whispered excuses suddenly. No one had believed in him. No one had known. No one had obeyed. That is how nations rewrite themselves, not with truth, but with denial. Nina survived. She and the children lived to see the Allied occupation. She wrote letters to the new German government, to the Allied command, asking one question: will my husband's name always mean traitor? For years, no one answered. Germany was too busy surviving to remember those who had died for its soul. But time is patient, truth moves slowly, like grass through concrete. In 1951, the new Federal Republic quietly acknowledged what the Third Reich never could: that those who resisted were not traitors, but patriots. Our names were cleared. Our families were freed from stigma. Our actions became lessons in schools, our faces printed in history books. And on the 20th of July every year, they lay a wreath in the courtyard where we fell. Children stand in silence. Soldiers salute. The same army that once executed us now honors us. It is the only justice history can give. I sometimes wonder what I would have thought, standing there again, seeing my children grown. Would I still have chosen to act, knowing we would fail? Yes, because failure in the service of conscience is not failure at all. It is the price of dignity. If I had done nothing, I would have survived. I might have grown old, watched the Reich fall, claimed ignorance like so many others, but my silence would have made me complicit, and that I could not bear. I remember the night before the attempt. The last real night of my life. I sat alone in my study, the lamp low, papers scattered outside. Berlin was quiet. Even the war seemed to hold its breath. I wrote in my journal: there must be an end to this madness. The man who brought ruin to Germany must be stopped, whatever the cost. I sealed the letter and left it on the desk. It was found later, among the ashes of our house. Nina kept it until her death. Today, it sits behind glass in a museum. People walk by it, reading the words I never meant for anyone but her, and I hope they understand what I meant. That sometimes love for one's country means standing against it. The war ended, but the echo of it never truly did. Even now, the world remembers our failure, but it also remembers our attempt. The attempt matters. It always does. Because tyranny does not die when the tyrant falls. It dies when ordinary men and women find the courage to say, enough. That is what I wanted my children to know. Not that their father was a hero. I was not. But that he tried, when others would not. Years later, when people visit the Bendler block, they stand in that same courtyard. The bullet marks are still there, dark on the wall. The gravel crunches beneath their feet just as it did that night. But now, the air is different. Now it carries remembrance instead of fear. Somewhere, a child asks, who were they? And the guide answers, they were Germans who said no. That is enough. That is all I ever wanted history to say. Because every act of conscience begins with a single thought, that one must do what is right, even when it costs everything. The rest The speeches, the medals, the memory, those are only shadows. The real victory lies in the choice itself. To stand, to resist, to remember. And if the world should ever forget, if tyranny should rise again, then perhaps another man, in another uniform, will whisper the same words I once did. Long live sacred Germany, and mean them not as an oath to power, but as a promise to humanity.